Hello everyone and welcome to this month's synth tutorial with computer music. And this month we're going to be creating a PWM pad sound exclusively with our freely downloadable Zebra CM plugin. PWM stands for pulse width modulation, and this particular type of pad sound is really useful when you want a pad that doesn't just sit there and do nothing, but actually has a little bit of movement and depth to it. So let's dive straight in. Load up your favourite DAW, place in an instance of the Zebra CM plugin, and the first thing we need to do is make sure we do an initialize, and we do that by going to the display at the top, where there's also a menu if you click on it, come down to where it says Init for initialize, and that will initialize the plugin. It's also worth mentioning at this point that the upper display here will display all sorts of parameters relating to the things that we change on the plugin. So do keep an eagle eye out at the top there, because the values we'll be describing will be displayed there. This patch is going to be a relatively intense sound, so consequently it's a good idea to turn our volume down before we start. We're going to go down to the bottom right hand side where it says Master, and the Master volume pot is directly below it. We're going to click and hold on that, place it at around about the 12 o'clock mark, which will also read 50 in the display at the top. Let's begin with oscillator number 1. So we're going to go to the top left hand side of the plugin where we have the oscillator 1 section, and the first thing we need to do in this section is change the waveform. We're going to change it to a square wave, and we do this by going to the wave icon, which is directly in the middle of this section, clicking and holding with the mouse and dragging it up until we either see a square wave or a value of 2 at the top. We also want to decrease the volume of oscillator 1 immediately, so moving to the left where we see the volume control for oscillator 1, click, hold, drag the mouse down and set it to a value of 70. Next up is oscillator 2. Now many of the settings that we need in oscillator 2 are already set by default, but we're just going to check them just in case. So first of all, within the oscillator 2 section, check that we have a sawtooth displayed. You can see this by the recognisable icon that looks like a tooth from a saw. Oscillator 2 is going to be playing the sawtooth exactly 1 octave above oscillator 1. So we make this happen by visiting the tuning pot, which is directly above the sawtooth display, clicking and holding and dragging this up to a value of 12 on the upper display. It's 12 because we're dealing in semitones, and there are 12 semitones to an octave. At the moment, the volume of oscillator 2 is turned all the way down. We're actually going to leave it that way, but what we're going to do is use envelope 2 to control the volume of oscillator 2. The way we apply this modulation is by going to the oscillator 2 section where we see the volume pot, and directly below it there's a drop-down menu. From that drop-down menu, select envelope 2. Once selected, you then have to set the modulation amount, and you do this by clicking and holding on the tiny little dot which is located just to the right of the volume control. Drag that all the way up to the top so that it reads 100. Now we're going to move to the filter section on the right hand side, and actually by default the filter will be set to LP 12 dB. That's the filter we want on this occasion. A 12 dB filter is also known as a two-pole filter, and it's certainly at the more aggressive end of filter timbres. We do, however, want to turn down some of the brightness that's in the sound, and we do this by changing the cutoff amount. So we're going to click and hold on the cutoff pot and drag that down so that the upper display reads a value of 95. Now it's time to make some alterations to the envelopes. Envelope 1 is going to be controlling the volume of our sound in terms of its overall amplitude. We need to make 2 adjustments here. Firstly, to the attack pot, we're going to change this to a value of 20. And secondly, we're going to make an adjustment to the release pot, which we're going to set to a value of 35. Then we need to move down to envelope 2. Now envelope 2 is going to be exclusively controlling the volume or the amplitude of oscillator 2. That's why we set the modulation routing earlier. We need to make 2 very similar settings here. First of all, the attack phase to 70, and secondly, the release phase to 40. Now we've done that, when you play a sound, you should hear something like this. Now it's still a little bit static, and we want to generate some movement in that sound, and this is where the pulse width modulation will come into play. In order to set up the pulse width modulation, we need to use the low frequency oscillator section to generate our modulation source. Move to the LFO section on the right hand side and ensure that we're looking at LFO1. You'll have this confirmed by ensuring that LFO1 is highlighted in the turquoise blue. It's also then worth checking that we have a sine wave selected in the waveform drop-down, which is also in the LFO section. The final tweak we need to make here is to the synchronization. There's a drop-down menu here, and we need to change it to quarter note. The synchronization relates to the tempo of your DAW, and this means that by setting it to a quarter note, for every quarter note that plays in your DAW, we get a complete cycle of the LFO. Having set the modulation source, we now need to set the modulation destination. This is going to be the waveform within the Oscillator 1 section. So going back to the Oscillator 1 section, directly below the waveform icon, you'll see that there is a wave pot, and directly below that, there is a drop-down menu. Ensure that the drop-down menu has LFO1 selected. Once you've done that, we need to set a modulation amount, and this is done on the wave pot. So clicking and holding on the wave pot, and set the value to 1.50. Having set the LFO destination and set the amount, we should now have a sound like this. And as you can hear, there's plenty of movement in that sound now. Now our sound is pretty much good to go, but we're going to use a couple of other techniques to just thicken it up even further. And the first place we can start is by adding some effects. We're going to use a modulation effect from within the ZebraCM plugin. And to activate this, we move down to the bottom right hand side, and you'll see that there's 3 effects that are already plugged in heading towards the master bus, but they're all deactivated at present. We need to activate them by double clicking on the top one, which is described as Mod FX. Mod Effects stands for Modulation Effects, and if we now move over to the left hand side of the plugin on the bottom row, you'll see there's that section there described as Mod FX. Currently we have a phaser plugged in. We're going to change this to a chorus by clicking on the legend that says phaser and selecting chorus instead. We now have a sound like this. And you can hear that's really thickened it up nicely. At this stage you can add any number of back-end effects that you like, such as reverb. However, we're going to do something a little different and add some delay. Now we're going to use a delay which is already plugged in as part of our Logic suite here. And you can see here that we have a stereo delay plugged in with both independent controls for left channel delay and right channel delay. Now one of the things we've done is altered the timing, so we have a quarter note timing on the left channel and an eighth note dotted timing on the right channel. You can then further adjust things like your feedback control to get the desired effect, and it means that every time you play a note or a chord, you get a little bit of dissipation on the back end as you release the notes. And that will really help as you move from one chord or note to another. So that's our patch for our PWM pad. We'll see you next time.